Just a note to say that this video will contain spoilers for Nocturnal Animals if you haven't seen it already, and it also contains discussions of sexual violence and its representation in media that some viewers may find distressing. So on the morning that I recorded this, Sunday the 22nd of January, I noted that something quite unusual was happening on Twitter, namely the fact that Nocturnal Animals was trending in the UK, which I thought was quite weird, because that movie came out over 2 months ago. Why has everyone suddenly started talking about it again? It turns out this was related to an article that was published that day by Victoria Coren Mitchell in The Observer, and she published a very negative opinion of the movie. That in and of itself is not my problem. I read the article and became quite frustrated with it, and it was because I felt it was not a good piece of criticism. Now let me contextualise that. When I say that it's not a good piece of criticism, that doesn't mean me saying, oh, it's not a positive review, therefore it's not a good piece of criticism. What I'm saying is that it's a negative review, but it's written badly. It's not a well-written analysis of a particular piece. I think it's a very reductive take on that particular movie. I have reviewed that film in the past, I gave it quite a positive review, but at the same time, I can very much understand why someone would have problems with that movie, and it's definitely a film that really isn't for everyone. And I would like to stress that this is not meant to be an attack on Victoria Coren Mitchell. I think she's done some great writing in the past, I like her TV appearances. This article, I think, just has a lot of problems, and the reason that I'm talking about it is because I think it brings up a lot of issues with reviewing and the nature of reviews and how they're written that I think would be quite interesting to my audience. And because a lot of you do write your own analysis and you talk about my reviews, and I think it's interesting to sort of talk about the considerations that one has to think about when writing a piece of criticism. And therefore I'm going to talk about my problems with this particular article and why reviews do certain things that they do. The basic gist of the article that I'll link to on this video so you can make your own assessment is that Coren Mitchell caught up with the movie once it received a number of BAFTA nominations, and when she saw it she objected to its treatment of women, specifically citing 2 major sequences within it, which I'll get to in a moment. And she doesn't feel that it deserves the critical praise that's been lavished upon it, nor the awards nominations. And again, just because she wrote a negative review, that's not the issue here at all. In fact, I would go so far as to argue that some of the debates that Coren Mitchell brings up in the article are ones that I had in my own mind when I was thinking upon the movie after I saw it. But the issue with the actual article itself is on a number of different levels. The first one is that reading the article, you don't really get a good sense of what the film is actually about. When you're writing a review, you need to construct it in a way that assumes that your audience doesn't know what you're talking about. Not everyone has seen the film in question. This is a particular problem for me with this article because it seems specifically targeted at people that haven't actually seen this movie yet but would be curious to see it because of all the awards nominations it has received. And it seems more, whether this was intentional or not, like a hit piece. And the reason that I feel this way is because the review is crucially missing context. And I don't just mean, oh, talking about the events in the movie, I mean the actual plot of the movie is missing from this article. It doesn't actually tell you what the film is about. Most reviews, you know, for the benefit of both the filmmakers and the reader, who generally you assume is someone who hasn't seen it yet and is making their own decision on whether or not to see it based on your opinion, is to you know, act in good faith and give a balanced plot synopsis of what exactly the film is about. Instead, it specifically cites those 2 major sequences in the movie, namely a double rape and murder that happens later on in the film and its opening title sequence. And I have thoughts on both of those, and again, I'll get to those later. But if you were to just simply read this article without knowing anything about this movie whatsoever, and that's entirely possible, you would get the impression that the entire film is basically, oh, a man has his wife and daughter kidnapped, they get raped and murdered. Oh, and here's an opening title sequence of some overweight women in slow motion. That's the end of the movie. It fundamentally yanks two particular sections out of context as a way of trying to shock the reader. I can't believe this movie did this. I can't believe how shocking this event is. And this is to replicate Colin Mitchell's own disgust at those particular elements. But it means that the reader doesn't get a fair assessment of how those actually are incorporated into the narrative, because you haven't given them the narrative to begin with. You can't make an assessment on something that you don't know about, and it's just not there in the article. Which brings me to our second point. There's a distinct lack of reading the text here. Corin Mitchell doesn't appear to try and engage with the narrative, which is what the lack of a plot synopsis is symptomatic of. And this is very important when trying to address scenes like this and the wider concerns of their narrative, whether you agree with them or not. And this is something that you need to consider, because this context is everything. It explains why one movie can do something like this and it not work, and why it works in something else. It's very crucial that you make that come across to your reader. You need to articulate it properly, and I don't think this article does that. This is particularly important in the case of Nocturnal Animals because it's a multi-stranded movie where each of the timelines feed off of each other and give each other meaning. It's very crucial that you ground these scenes in where they are in the narrative and how they relate to each other, and this article is missing that. And that doesn't work as criticism, because again, you've divorced it from the entire text. Whereas if you were trying to make an argument for why you were objecting to something, the best way to do that is to connect it to the overarching nature of the text as a whole. Because I could understand if you were to write a review of Nocturnal Animals thinking it was misogynist, because you could make that argument. And I could see in my mind how you could structure that in the wider sense of how the movie plays out. It feels like Corin Mitchell was so disgusted by these scenes, she refused to try and play with the movie or get a sense of how it works on a larger scale, so that her criticisms can be placed in the wider sense of the narrative. It's important that you get this across, because otherwise it feels like it's a surface reading. You're reacting to something impulsively, but without addressing why you did so. And I can understand where Corin Mitchell's complaints come from. The opening sequence, for example, which has in long, protracted slow motion, very overweight women dancing full frontal as the credits roll. It's a very jarring sequence that even as I reviewed the movie at the time, I thought might have been a misstep. As much as I tried to later find some sort of contextual meaning in it, it does feel like it doesn't really work with the rest of the movie. And I can completely understand why that would be troubling to a reader of the film. But when it comes to the issue of rape, again, you need to provide the context, because the way that movies deal with rape is a very difficult issue in of itself. And I can understand as a female writer that being particularly problematic, and even as a male watcher, that is something that I'm particularly strong in my feelings about. This is something that I feel very strongly about, in that I've seen a lot of bad movies, and I've seen a lot of very bad movies use rape as a simple plot device, especially ones by male writers to try and justify acts of retribution by male characters to come. The standard narrative of they raped his wife, he's coming for vengeance, and to a certain extent you could apply that to Nocturnal Animals. I've also seen movies that have used rape casually and almost flippantly. There's at least one movie I can think of where there's a rape sequence that happens and is so glanced over you could edit that entire instant from the movie and it wouldn't have any effect on the narrative whatsoever, or even the character. That really gets my blood boiling. of course, long-time viewers of my work will know how infamously seething I got about The Cavern, which smash cut to credits in a rape scene as a cheap shock effect. That made me legitimately angry. However, I feel that Nocturnal Animals has a strong narrative framework as to why those particular elements were used, and not simply because they were tropes of the pulpy thrillers that the novel within the film's storyline is addressing. The story of the film is that Susan is desperately unhappy with her wealthy lifestyle in LA. She's played by Amy Adams, and she receives a manuscript from her ex-husband Edward, played by Jake Gyllenhaal, the titular Nocturnal Animals, which is this dark, violent, neo-noir thriller. And as Susan reads through it, she begins to interpret it as maybe being a possible attack or act of revenge from Edward upon her. And this is partly because she recognises its main character Tony as an obvious author surrogate for Edward, hence why Tony in that particular timeline of the movie is also played by Gyllenhaal. And this is fundamental to your understanding of what follows afterwards. Because early on in the novel, Tony and his family are run off the road by a bunch of hillbilly rednecks led by Ray, played by Aaron Taylor Johnson, who eventually, after a long, sustained period of menace and sexual threat, kidnap Tony's wife and daughter and later rape and murder them. The thing about this is that in the wider terms of the story, this moment has major significance because we start to interpret everything that happens within this particular structure of the movie through the prism of Susan and Edward's relationship, which is being played across in flashback. And late in the movie, we discover that Susan divorced Edward and secretly tried to abort his child. He discovers that after she's terminated their baby, while also finding her in the arms of her new lover, played by Armie Hammer. And this particular element, I'm surprised that Corin Mitchell didn't bring up, because it was something that troubled me on my viewing of the movie, because it is something that was added by director Tom Ford when he wrote the script. This wasn't from its source novel, Tony and Susan. This was something newly added to the film, and I did worry about the depiction of abortion on film in this particular case. That's again a subject matter that I feel needs to be treated especially carefully. This particular revelation makes you understand why Edward has written that particular element into his novel. The novel is basically him both assessing his relationship with Susan while also extending judgment upon himself for perhaps being too gentle, too soft, and so he feels he has to prove himself by being cruel as a writer. And obviously, the fact that his family is taken away from him is symbolic of the split between him and Susan and the loss of their child. That is a direct echo there. And even if you feel that that particular element of the movie has got its issues, Corin Mitchell doesn't bring up anything related to this framing storyline that helps the reader contextualize and judge the movie properly. This is the issue here. If you want the reader to judge something by your opinion, you need to play fair and make sure it's representative of that particular work. And I don't think Corin Mitchell provides nearly enough context for the reader to accurately judge the character or the tone of the movie. As someone who does a lot of reviews of bad movies, I'm pretty sure that there are certain sections of my audience that are going, well, hang on a minute, this is a little bit hypocritical, you sanctimonious so-and-so. Don't you also do reviews where you go through movies and you cherry-pick clips out to highlight your opinions? I do, but those are cast against a strong backbone of a synopsis and going through the narrative and addressing those concerns as they come up. So, if the viewer hasn't seen the movie, they'll be familiar enough with the movie's structure and plotting that they'll be able to cast their own judgment on whether or not they agree with my opinions. And this is important, especially when you're reviewing a work that you either disagree with or you think is bad. You need to apply those criticisms to the wider work as a whole to show to the reader or viewer that you understand what the work is trying to put across and have tried to engage with it, but still have problems with it. It's the difference between reviewing something off the back of a couple of clips on YouTube and watching the whole thing. It's why people get so offended, understandably so, when critics try to review movies that they've walked out of, because they can't make a fair assessment of what they've tried to do. By showing those particular moments in a sense of context, it shows that you've tried to judge the movie in some way that's fair. You're playing on the same field, as it were, as the work itself, and I don't feel that this comes across. And while I disagree with Corin's assessment, that is neither here nor there, really. It's not about right or wrong when it comes to criticism. People get that wrong. It's not about that. It's about how well you argue it, and this article doesn't argue that very well. I personally would argue that the movie isn't really misogynistic so much as the film in general is about the subject matter of cruelty, and Susan acted cruelly with Edward's love, and in return he's become a much coarser person. There is definitely an argument to be made about male entitlement and very much the sort of male revenge fantasy that comes within the Nocturnal Animals novel within the film. And several critics have pointed that out, but I could understand why some viewers might interpret that as just general misogyny, and that is perfectly within their right to come with that sort of interpretation, because movies don't exist in a vacuum. They are what viewers bring to them. Personally, I'm always worried in the back of my mind about whether I've either misrepresented the character of a work or I haven't argued my case well enough. And I know a lot of people who review media probably sympathise with those concerns and those fears. And I'm always conscious of the fact that as much as it looks like a conveyor belt from the outside, movies are actually the product of a lot of people working together and a lot of time and effort. And that's why something like Triple X deserves to be given the same fair shake as a highbrow Oscar contender like Nocturnal Animals. And that's what bothered me about this article most, is that not only did I feel it misrepresent the character of the film it was reviewing, but because and in spite of that, it didn't argue its case very well. And the thing that really irritated me is because it focused so much on those two particular elements without justifying it to the work as a whole, because you could do that to any movie. You could take the worst misjudged moments of even the most mediocre movie, or even a great one, and say, this is terrible, with almost nothing to back it up. That's not reviewing, that's not critiquing. I would call that close to smearing. And you've got to be aware of that. You need to make sure that you're not just simply attacking something, you're just trying to give an understanding to the reader or the viewer of how you feel about something, and not simply just completely go on the offensive. You've got to be mindful of the work as a whole. And so with that in mind, happy watching, everyone.